A mysterious woman emerges from the dunes, carrying an ancestral mark that saves a village from ruin. When a stranger discovers her secret, the desert reveals its transformative power, a journey of redemption where the impossible becomes hope. Among sands that hide intertwined destinies, this story will touch your soul. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from this desert legend that will change your heart forever. At the break of dawn, when the wind whispered forgotten promises across the dunes stretching as far as the eye could see, life in the settlement of St. Anthony's Crossing was a daily effort, a silent battle against the arid vastness that surrounded them. The sun, relentless, rose on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mock the paleness of the dry land below. Every grain of sand seemed to carry the weight of years of neglect and hardship. The wooden structures, built with sweat and stubbornness, creaked under the pressure of time and the elements, their faded facades bearing witness to the harshness of life on the frontier of the Badlands. In the reluctant heart of St. Anthony's Crossing, the saloon was a precarious refuge, a place where the bitterness of cachaça, Brazilian sugarcane, spirit tried without success to drown the bitterness of reality. There, under the dim light of oil lamps, men in dusty hats and women with faces marked by the drought exchanged weary glances and few words. The smell of old wood, tobacco smoke, and cheap liquor permeated the air, a mixture that defined the heavy atmosphere of the place. Life was hard, yes, but there was an underground resilience in those hearts, a stubborn faith that somehow they would overcome. Far from the exhausted bustle of the village, in an isolated cabin on the edges of the desert that stretched like a golden, implacable sea, lived Ben. His eyes, blue like the sky before a sandstorm, carried the depth and pain of one who had seen too much and spoken too little. His hands, thick and calloused, didn't just hold reins or handle tools. They seemed to feel the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, reading it like an old scroll, parchment. Ben was a tracker, one of the last of a generation who knew how to decipher the signs nature left, find trails where there seemed to be none, and, most crucially, find water where thirst was the only companion. But Ben's skill came with a heavy burden. Years ago, in a neighboring settlement, he failed. He failed to find water in time, failed to warn about the approaching drought with the fury of a silent beast. Guilt gnawed at him from within, an open wound that led him to isolate himself, to live on the margins, haunted by the ghosts of those who could not be saved. The desert was his self-imposed exile, a mirror of his own inner aridity. He felt like a solitary cactus, capable of enduring the drought but unable to bloom. Ben's routine was monotonous, marked by the sun's slow dance in the sky and the constant whisper of the wind. Solitary walks, studying the stars for nocturnal navigation, the incessant search for any sign of life or moisture. He lived with the bare minimum, trading skins and rare finds for provisions in the village, always avoiding prolonged contact. Faith for him was something fragile, which had shattered like glass under the scorching sun. Hope was a luxury he could not afford. The light of his soul seemed to have been sucked out by the dark vastness of his regret. The characters who inhabited St. Anthony's Crossing were a reflection of that land. There was Mrs. Agnes, the healer, a woman whose eyes shone with a wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself. She knew the secrets of the desert plants, those that bloomed, against all odds offering healing and sustenance. Her main motivation was to preserve the ancestral knowledge that her grandmother, also a healer, had passed down to her. For her, every leaf, every root, was a piece of her people's history, and letting it die would be a betrayal of her ancestors' memory. Her faith was in nature, in life's ability to persist even in the harshest conditions. Her presence in the village was a balm, a reminder that hope could be found in unexpected places, like water under the sand. There was also Sheriff Elias, tired, with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen many fights and few easy solutions. Elias was a pragmatic man. He dreamed of peace but was content to maintain order, ensuring conflicts were resolved before they became too violent. His motivation was simple: the survival of the village. The prolonged drought wore him down. Each day without rain was another weight on his shoulders. He saw faith and hope as tools, useful when they motivated people, dangerous when they became delusions leading to irrational actions. The light for him was the sunlight that illuminated clear rules and order. And there was Peter, the blacksmith's apprentice, helper, restless, a dreamer, with hands that had not yet known the true hardness of work in the desert. Peter longed for recognition. He wanted to prove his worth in a place where everyone seemed to have a story to tell, a deed to be remembered, except him. He saw the desert as a test, a furnace that would forge his destiny. His faith was in his own ability to overcome. His hope was for a future where his name was respected. He sought the light that would lift him out of the shadow of the more experienced. The settlement of St. Anthony's Crossing faced a drought that went beyond the natural cycle. Months passed without a significant drop of rain. The streams that once murmured were now just beds of cracked stones. The wells, once sources of life, were dangerously low, their waters murky and scarce. Cattle in the corrals languished, their sad lowing echoing under the empty sky. Whispers of giving up, of abandoning everything and trying their luck elsewhere, began to circulate in the corners of the saloon and in hushed conversations on the porches of the houses. Fear, like fine, irritating dust, settled in their hearts. It was in this climate of growing despair that the letter arrived. A messenger, thin and exhausted, stumbled into the saloon, his worn boots bloody, testifying to a long and arduous journey. He handed a yellowed, sand-stained paper to Sheriff Elias. The letter contained only 5 words, written in a trembling hand, but their impact was immediate and profound. "The mark is back. We need him." Sheriff Elias read the words aloud, his hoarse voice breaking the tense silence. The mark. The name evoked ancient legends, stories of a symbol that appeared in the sand, a dark omen before the wells dried up completely, before the land died. You truly believed in the legend, considering it just an old wives' tale to scare children. But now, the letter claimed it had returned. And worse, they needed him. Everyone knew who the letter referred to. The tracker who lived in isolation. The man many blamed for past droughts, or at least for not having prevented the worst. Ben. The mention of Ben's name brought looks of resentment from some, curiosity from others. The tension in the room noticeably increased. The sheriff, despite his skepticism, felt a chill down his spine. There was something in the messenger's exhaustion, in the hopelessness in his eyes, that made the legend terribly real at that moment. They needed Ben. The man who had fled his past was now the only hope. The irony was bitter, like the brackish water remaining in some wells. Hope, that faint spark, needed to be rekindled by the hand of the man who had lost it. The letter was delivered to Ben at his isolated cabin. The messenger, before collapsing from exhaustion, repeated the words. Ben looked at the paper, at the shaky letters, feeling the weight of years returning with the force of a sandstorm. He, who had tried to become invisible, was now sought after. They needed him because of the mark. The legend he himself had heard as a young man, which seemed like a sinister fairy tale, now called him back to the world he had abandoned. His heart, which felt as dry as the surrounding land, felt a pang, a vestige of something he thought had died. Responsibility, or perhaps just the dark curiosity of someone confronted with a ghost from the past. He was like a wounded coyote, dragging himself to a dark corner to lick his wounds, but which relentless life forces back into the hunt. Reluctantly, but moved by an old debt to the messenger, a man from a nearby settlement who had once saved his life, Ben agreed to investigate. Not out of altruism, he thought, but to silence the voice of guilt that screamed louder than the wind. The first twist came quickly. He joined a small reconnaissance group organized by the sheriff, including Mrs. Agnes, whose wisdom about the land could be useful, and Peter, eager to prove himself. Following the few clues and descriptions of the mark reported in the letter, Ben discovered that the symbol was not just a drawing in the sand, as the legend described. It was something much more subtle and sinister. The mark also appeared on dying plants, a nearly invisible pattern of desiccation in their leaves and stems, something only trained eyes like Ben's and, surprisingly, Mrs. Agnes's, who saw the desert differently, could perceive. It was a sign that water was being sucked from below, not just evaporating from the sun. This realization was the first moment of high tension. The mark was not just a symbol, it was a symptom, and what caused the symptom was unknown and, possibly, dangerous. The air became denser, heavy not just with dust but with a palpable apprehension. The drought took on contours of mystery, of something more sinister than simple lack of rain. For Ben, it was confirmation that his dark past was intimately linked to what was happening now. The mark haunted him just like guilt. During an initial expedition to follow these new signs, the small caravan led by Ben found an oasis. Not a known oasis, marked on old maps, but a place that seemed to have sprung from nowhere, hidden among rock formations that protected its waters from relentless evaporation. The palm trees swayed gently like green sentinels in a golden sea, and the crystal-clear water in the well was a miracle that made everyone stop, marveling. It was a place of unexpected beauty, a makeshift sanctuary of peace in the midst of harshness. It was there, in that improvised sanctuary, that the first significant encounter between Ben and Mrs. Agnes occurred. While the others rested, refilling canteens and tending to the animals, Ben moved away slightly, observing the horizon and the ground around him carefully. His mind tried to reconcile the existence of that paradise with the signs of danger that had brought them there. Mrs. Agnes approached silently, carrying a small gourd, drinking vessel. "For tired eyes that try to read what the desert hides," she said softly, offering him a herbal infusion that smelled of damp earth and something sweet. It was a refreshing drink that relieved the dryness of the throat and seemed to clear his thoughts. Ben accepted with a nod, surprised by her kindness and perception. Her simple gesture of sharing water and knowledge, the exchange of relief in the midst of difficulty, created the first link of an unexpected connection, a point of light in the darkness of his solitude. The second twist came when, despite the apparent exuberance of the oasis, Ben and Mrs. Agnes noticed the same mysterious signs of the marks. Small perforations in the soil, almost imperceptible, formed complex patterns resembling constellations, extending from the edges of the well. And on the leaves of the few plants that weren't entirely healthy, the same desiccation pattern. Ben recognized those patterns from something he had seen years ago, something he had thought was just an isolated anomaly. But he kept this knowledge to himself, a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit yet, but that made him uneasy. He felt like a predator tracking a fresh trail, but without knowing what kind of prey awaited him. Upon returning to the village, the situation had drastically worsened. The main wells of St. Anthony's Crossing were beginning to dry up inexplicably fast, much more than normal evaporation would justify. Panic set in among the residents. The faith of some was shaken. Hope became a distant whisper. Divisions emerged, those who believed in natural causes and asked for patience and economy, and others who whispered about ancient curses, enraged desert spirits, or worse, the return of the creatures that legend said lived beneath the sand. Sheriff Elias, pressured by the growing anxiety, established a strict water rationing, generating immediate conflicts and fights at the few distribution points. The order he so cherished began to crumble like dry earth. During this period of growing anxiety and fear, Ben and Mrs. Agnes began working together more intensely. They spent hours in Ben's small, isolated cabin, or in Mrs. Agnes's shed, studying old maps that showed the region's geography before the great droughts, comparing them with the patterns of the marks they had found. In the flickering light of oil lamps, with the smell of old scrolls, parchments, dry earth brought in by their boots, and the sweet aroma of the herbs Mrs. Agnes dried hanging, they exchanged not just information, but also stories of their lives. She spoke of her grandmother, of the importance of respecting the land, of how nature always found a way to persist if treated with care. He, initially reluctant, began to share fragments of his past, life before becoming the solitary tracker, the tragedy that haunted him. She listened with serene patience, without judgment, just with silent understanding. One night, as he studied a map by the flickering light, she handed him a small amulet, roughly carved from the wood of a twisted desert shrub. It was simple, but made with care. "To find your way back," she explained, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his for a brief instant. As she handed him the object, her fingers touched his, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected current through Ben's calloused body. It was the second crucial moment in building trust between them, a significant gift that transcended utility, a symbol of hope in the midst of hopelessness. The faith he thought he had lost seemed to want to rekindle with her presence. Meanwhile, Peter, the blacksmith's apprentice and helper, tried to find his place in the crisis. He dedicated himself to repairing water pumps and tools, working to exhaustion. But he felt it wasn't enough. He needed something grander to prove his worth. He watched Ben and Mrs. Agnes working together, feeling excluded from that knowledge that seemed to be the key to everything. His restlessness was palpable, a secondary tension thread in the main plot. Sheriff Elias struggled to maintain order, dealing with growing scarcity and fear that turned into anger. He viewed Ben's situation with a mixture of distrust and the faint hope that the tracker could actually solve the mystery. He was like a tired bull, digging his heels into the sand, refusing to yield, but feeling his strength abandoning him. The search for the marks continued. Ben and Mrs. Agnes, now accompanied by a small group of volunteers, including Peter and some men from the village, followed the subtle patterns that stretched westward into a part of the desert considered impassable by most. Each day, the landscape became more hostile. The dunes became gigantic, the rocks sharper. The heat was overwhelming during the day, the cold biting at night. The smell of dry earth and sweat was constant, punctuated only by the bitter aroma of the few resilient plants. As they followed the marks, Ben began to notice something disturbing. The patterns became more intense, more numerous, the closer they got to the heart of the desert. It wasn't a random distribution. There seemed to be a central point to which everything converged. They were following a network, like worker ant trails, but on a much larger scale. Ben remembered what he had seen years ago, the isolated pattern, and the piece of the puzzle began to make a sinister noise in his mind. He realized that the marks were not just signs. They were escape routes. Something was moving beneath the earth, forcing the creatures that made the marks to emerge or displace themselves, draining the water in the process. Tension reached a new peak. They weren't just dealing with drought. They were following something alive and unknown beneath their feet. The sand under their boots seemed more menacing, hiding dangerous secrets. Each step was cautious, each sound an alert. The group felt like a flock of small animals cornered, following a trail dictated by an invisible force. Fear mixed with determination. They couldn't go back now. The hope of finding a solution propelled them, although each day that hope seemed fainter. Daylight revealed an even more implacable desert. The starlight at night seemed distant and cold, as if the sky itself had abandoned that land. The great twist that led to the climax of danger was revealed after weeks of following the marks. The group discovered that the marks were not the work of humans, nor divine, nor of ancestral spirits, but rather the result of an ancient and vast underground network of tunnels. These tunnels were the dwelling place of creatures that lived beneath the sand, adapted to this extreme environment. In search of water for themselves or perhaps fleeing from something larger, they unconsciously drained the surface and subsurface aquifers that fed the settlement's wells. The legend of the mark was not a curse, but an ecological signal, a warning that the underground balance was broken. During a riskier expedition to map these tunnels, descending through a natural fissure in the ground that seemed to lead directly to the underworld, a violent and sudden sandstorm struck the surface. The sky turned blood orange, the wind howled with the force of 1,000 demons, and the sand moved in giant waves that swallowed everything. The small group that was underground, including Ben and Mrs. Agnes, managed to take shelter in a natural cave within the network of tunnels, but the rest of the group on the surface, including Peter, was scattered and forced to return to the village as best they could. Ben and Mrs. Agnes found themselves isolated in the cave. The storm sealed the entrance, turning the refuge into a makeshift prison. They were trapped for 3 days, the hypnotic sound of sand lashing the rock walls. Outside was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Their provisions dwindled rapidly. Hunger and thirst became unwanted companions. It was there, in the oppressive darkness of the cave, with the only light coming from a small campfire made with remnants of wood they managed to find, that they shared their deepest fears, the third crucial moment in the building of their intimacy. "I'm afraid my knowledge will die with me," Mrs. Agnes confessed almost in a whisper, as the storm howled outside like a raging beast. "Every plant I can't save, every recipe I can't pass on takes with it secrets that will never return. I feel like I'm fighting against time and against forgetting." Her voice, usually firm, was tinged with vulnerability. Ben, looking at the fire's flames that danced on the cave walls, echoed the confession with his own pain. "And I fear that all the trails I know will only lead me back to the same mistakes, that no matter how much I walk or how much I search, I'm destined to fail, again, to see life drain away because of me." He revealed the guilt that haunted him, the story of the neighboring settlement he had abandoned. It was the first time he had spoken of it openly with anyone. This shared vulnerability, the exchange of heavy burdens underground, framed by the sound of the storm and the flickering light of the campfire that seemed to be the only light in the world, sealed a complicity that transcended circumstances. They saw each other not just as partners in the search, but as wounded souls who found comfort in each other's presence. The faith of one began to lean on the hope of the other, and together they found a light in the shared darkness. They were like two animals cornered by the storm, seeking shelter in each other, finding strength in union. When the storm finally subsided and they managed to remove the debris blocking the exit, they discovered the gravest twist. The storm had completely altered the landscape on the surface. Dunes that were once stable were now moving mountains of sand. And worse, a vast dune was rapidly advancing towards the village of St. Anthony's Crossing, threatening to bury it under tons of sand. The danger was no longer just the drought. It was the earth itself moving against them. At this critical moment, the tracker made a sacrificial decision, the fourth crucial moment in his relationship with Mrs. Agnes, and a major turning point in the plot. Using his unique knowledge of the behavior of the underground creatures and the patterns they formed, Ben proposed deviating completely from the safe route back to the village. Instead of returning, he suggested they follow the underground network of tunnels deeper into the desert, towards a point he suspected was the center of the network, the main source from which the creatures dispersed. If they could understand the pattern of the tunnels and the origin of the creatures' movement, perhaps they could find the main source of water that somehow was being diverted or blocked. It was a dangerous route, a desperate gamble, but if successful, it could save not just St. Anthony's Crossing, but all the settlements in the region threatened by the growing drought. Mrs. Agnes did not hesitate. She believed in Ben, not just as a tracker, but as a man. Peter and the others who found them after the storm were shocked by the proposal, but the hopelessness of the situation and the conviction in the eyes of Ben and Mrs. Agnes convinced them to follow. It was an act of faith. They placed their lives in the hands of the reclusive tracker, driven by the hope of finding a light at the end of that dark tunnel. It was the last obstacle to overcome before the potential resolution, a moment of intense suspense. Follow the unknown to an uncertain destination or return to a near-certain ruin. The final journey was brutal. The group, led by Ben and guided by Mrs. Agnes's knowledge of desert survival, faced scorching days where the sun seemed to want to fry them alive, and freezing nights where the cold penetrated to the bone. The smell of sweat, sand, and fear mingled. Each step cost twice the energy. The endless dunes seemed to multiply, and soon water and food supplies began to run dangerously low. The desert tested their limits, pushing them to the edge of collapse. It was then that Ben demonstrated his most valuable skill, the one that distinguished him from other trackers, and that he had honed in his solitude. Using ancestral techniques, reading the most subtle signs of the earth, he identified plants that, although they appeared dead on the surface, indicated deep moisture below. Digging methodically with his hands and improvised tools, he found small pockets of water, insufficient to quench everyone's thirst at once, but enough to keep them alive, to wet cracked lips, to moisten cloths and relieve the heat. It was a drop of hope in an ocean of despair, small victories achieved at an extremely high cost of energy and time. Mrs. Agnes, in turn, identified edible plants that everyone else had ignored as mere weeds, but which she knew were nutritious. Bitter, dry herbs that chewed slowly, offered some sustenance and in some cases helped retain moisture in the body. They were like two complements, the tracker who found the hidden water and the healer who revealed sustenance in the aridity. Together, they were stronger, their mutual faith fueling perseverance. The landscape gradually changed. From endless dunes stretching in all directions, they moved into a rocky, rugged terrain that no one in the group recognized. Steep cliffs rose like giant skeletons on the horizon. The tracker, following instincts he didn't fully understand, guided by the patterns of the marks that now appeared on the stones, led them to an impressive rock formation resembling a natural amphitheater. A circle of giant rocks with an opening facing the sky. In the center of this amphitheater, surrounded by ancient stones with inscriptions worn by time and wind, lay a well. It was a dry well, so old that no one alive in the village, or nearby settlements, could remember it functioning. It looked like an abandoned crater, a hole in the earth that told stories of a forgotten era. "This is older than our grandparents and their grandparents before them," Mrs. Agnes murmured, reverently touching the sea, inscriptions on the stones around the well. They were symbols she had never seen, but which emanated an ancestral energy. This was the place Ben felt the marks pointed to, the heart of the underground network. He looked at the dry well, feeling a strange resonance, as if looking at a reflection of his own empty soul. The greatest twist came when, upon inspecting the well and the tunnels that converged towards it, they discovered the truth about the creatures that lived beneath the sand. They weren't stealing water out of malice or because they were a plague. They were fleeing from something larger and more threatening that lived in the depths of the earth. And the marks, the patterns, were not a map to where the water was going, but rather a map to where the creatures were coming from and why. They pointed to this ancestral well. The well was not just dry, it was blocked. A colossal obstruction, formed over decades or perhaps centuries of sedimentation and underground collapses, had diverted the natural flow of a massive underground aquifer that once was the main source of all water in the region, feeding not only this well, but all the wells and streams that served the settlements. The ecological imbalance created by this obstruction forced the creatures to seek water elsewhere, draining the surface wells. The legend of the mark was not a curse, but an ecological signal, a cry for help from the earth itself, a map left by those who lived beneath it. Working tirelessly for days in the rocky amphitheater, under the sun that seemed to approve their struggle and the stars that watched silently at night, the group combined their knowledge. Ben used his understanding of the tunnel patterns to identify the exact point of the obstruction. Peter, with his blacksmith's apprentice, helper, strength, and ingenuity, improvised tools to help remove the debris. Mrs. Agnes, with her remedies and plant knowledge, kept everyone on their feet, treating exhaustion, minor injuries, and dehydration. It was the fifth crucial moment in the relationship between Ben and Mrs. Agnes, an act of mutual sacrifice, of total collaboration, where each put their skills and strength to the service of a greater goal, cementing their bond in an unbreakable way. They were now truly a team united by adversity and the hope that was reborn. Faith in the success of the endeavor moved them. The light of hope guided their calloused hands. The work was excruciating. Every stone removed seemed to weigh a ton. Dust rose in choking clouds. The sound of tools echoed against the rocks. There were moments of despair, of wanting to give up. But the sight of the dune advancing towards the village, the thought of Mrs. Agnes and the others waiting, and the weight of Ben's guilt propelled them. Sheriff Elias and some men from the village tried to slow the dune's advance with improvised barriers, an inglorious fight that bought precious time for the group at the well. The secondary narrative line of the sheriff and Peter intertwined here. Peter, who had returned injured from the storm, now led the building of the barriers, proving his worth through desperate action, finding his own light in the approaching darkness. The final high-tension moment arrived when, after days of hard work, they felt a vibration in the earth. The sound of water rushing in large quantities began to reach their ears, faint at first, then growing stronger, a distant roar, in the depths of the earth. They knew they were close to the obstruction, but the vibration also seemed to stir something in the depths. The marks on the rocks around the well seemed to subtly glow in the faint morning light, and the sound of the creatures that lived beneath the sand moving became clearer, closer. They were about to unblock the water, but what would happen when they did? Would the creatures flee? Or would whatever was driving them away come to the surface too? It was a final mystery before the resolution, a suspense that held their breath. Faith in success was tested by the fear of the unknown. Then, with a deafening noise of rocks shifting and water gushing, the obstruction gave way. The first drop of water emerged from the renewed well. A single drop dark against the dry stone. Then another and another, gradually turning into a thin trickle, then a crystal-clear stream, until finally, with a glorious roar that echoed through the rocks, a massive volume of pure, fresh water began to gush from the well, filling it rapidly. The water overflowed into the tunnels, reversing the flow that had previously drained the surface wells, pushing the creatures back into the depths, or towards other safe routes that the newly released water would create. It was as if the earth itself had sighed in relief, releasing a life that had been imprisoned. The morning sunlight reflected on the clear water, a dazzling spectacle of renewal. When the water reached a stable level, gushing with a constant force that promised life for the entire region, Ben and Mrs. Agnes found themselves side by side, exhausted, dirty, but transformed by the journey. Their hands, calloused and scratched, met briefly on the damp stone at the well's edge. No longer the hands of strangers united by necessity, but of partners who had faced the impossible together. The spark that had ignited between them in the cave under the storm had now become a strong flame, fueled by mutual faith and shared hope. Some trails need to be rediscovered with each generation, Mrs. Agnes said, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes meeting Ben's with a depth that said more than words. Just as some wells need to be unblocked for the water to flow again. The metaphor of the trail and the well now encompassed not only the land, but also their souls. They were like rivers that had found their way to the sea, overcoming obstacles, and finding their destiny in each other. With water gushing from the ancestral well, they knew the drought in St. Anthony's Crossing and neighboring settlements would end. It would take days or weeks for the water to travel through the underground network and replenish the wells, but the source had been found, the cause of the problem resolved. The Great Dune, deprived of the reason for the creature's movement, and the water that made it unstable would slow its advance, and the barriers erected, along with the change in the subterranean water flow, would be enough to protect the village. The return to St. Anthony's Crossing was triumphant, though discreet. Ben and the small group arrived, covered in dust, thin and weary, but with news worth more than gold. The news of the water, of the rediscovered source. Initial disbelief gave way to joy, gratitude, and finally, renewed faith. The wells began to fill slowly in the following days, a miracle that brought relief and hope to everyone. The dune slowed its march, stopped by the barriers and the rebalancing of the earth. Ben was no longer the solitary tracker haunted by guilt. His journey had transformed him. He had confronted his fears, taken responsibility, and in doing so, found not only redemption, but also a new purpose. His relationship with Mrs. Agnes flourished. They continued to work together, she teaching him more about the desert plants, he sharing his knowledge of the earth and its secrets. The faith he had lost, he found it again in her eyes, in the resilience of the earth and in the strength they discovered together. Hope became an inexhaustible well in their hearts. The light of their spirits, previously extinguished, now shone brightly, illuminating the path to a future that was uncertain but full of possibilities. They were like two trees that, after enduring the drought, finally find water and intertwine their roots to grow together, seeking the sunlight. Peter, the blacksmith's apprentice, helper, found the recognition he so longed for in the courage He showed facing the storm and the determination to protect the village. He learned that value was not just in grand deeds, but in daily perseverance and the ability to help. Sheriff Elias saw his faith in order restored and learned that at times the solution was not in clear rules and force, but in ancestral knowledge and the union of different people. The desert, previously seen only as an implacable enemy, revealed itself to be complex and full of hidden life. Creatures that lived beneath the sand were just part of a delicate ecosystem that, when unbalanced, affected everything on the surface. The legend of the mark ceased to be a frightening tale and became a lesson about the interconnectedness of all things. St. Anthony's Crossing, with its wells full and the threat of the dune averted, began to breathe again. Life pulsed more strongly in the saloon, in the houses, in the now viable fields. The smell of dust was still there, now mixed with the smell of damp earth and the sweet scent of desert flowers that bloomed after the water arrived. The hardness of the land remained, but hope and faith had taken deep roots like those of an old cactus. Ben and Mrs. Agnes, side by side, watched the sunset painting the sky, no longer a harbinger of relentless heat, but a promise of another day conquered. The desert remained vast and mysterious, but now they knew it also held secrets of life and renewal. And you, when will you let hope to bloom in your desert?